Welcome to Conjuncture. My name is Christina Heatherton. I'm delighted to be here today with Judah Schept, Professor of Justice Studies at Eastern Kentucky University. Judah is the author of the award-winning book, Progressive Punishment, with Jack Norton and Lydia Pellow-Hobbs. He's currently working on The Jail is Everywhere. As we'll discuss today, he's also the author of the recently published Coal Cages Crisis, The Rise of the Prison Economy in Central Appalachia. In all of Judah's work, he examines the carceral state, particularly in overlooked areas like Central Appalachia. His work is always grounded in the places that he's located and in struggles to fight the common sense underpinning prison expansion. He is a model of generous, rigorous, and engaged scholarship, and I'm delighted to be speaking with him here today in New Orleans at the workshop. So thanks so much for joining us, Judah.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So this show is called Conjuncture, and we talk a lot about conjunctures. We're interested in how scholars analyze them and also how they come to analyze them. In your new book, Coal Cages Crisis, you define this moment as a carceral conjuncture. Can you explain what you mean by this term, and how did you come to it?
Sure. Great question. It may make sense for me to start by kind of sketching out what the kind of carceral geography of the region looks like as a way to kind of back into answering that question. So there are 16 prisons in Central Appalachia, which includes Eastern Kentucky, parts of West Virginia, Southwestern Virginia, and Tennessee. 8 of those 16 are in Eastern Kentucky. And in addition to those 16 prisons, there's also just a bunch of jails, as there are everywhere. Part of my interest in the project was asking some very sort of general basic questions about that, like why are there so many prisons in this particular region? Why in this moment in time? How do folks understand them? And what's the sort of broader work that they perform, like the broader economic and political and cultural work that they perform? And so those were sort of the questions that I posed as an ethnographer to people in the region. And, you know, no doubt I was primed to sort of think in some ways through conjunctural analysis just by reading Gramsci and Stuart Hall and Ruthie Gilmore and Jordan Camp and others, right, who helped develop that kind of analysis. But it was really actually hearing from folks in the region that I think underwrote the importance of that concept and that frame of analysis. So the way that I posed questions to folks was really through the prisons, like why are there so many prisons here? What do you make of that? And more often than not, what I heard was not quite what I was expecting. The way that people answered was by saying, well, we have so many prisons because of the coal industry, or because of all of these coal waste storage ponds, or they would point to sort of the waste geography of the region and point to incinerators and landfills. And at least in one case, somebody also brought up Purdue Pharma and the sort of new iteration of the drug war and the role of drug companies. So that to me pushed me, I think, past what at least at that time was still sort of an impulse to think through punishment. I think I was sort of disciplined by my own training in criminology and criminal justice to kind of foreground an analysis of punishment. And it was hearing from folks in the field, you know, towards the beginning of my research in the region, that really pushed me to kind of take their analysis seriously and to really think through what, in fact, the prison shares the landscape with. And of course, they were totally right. When you begin to kind of unpack why there are, in fact, so many prisons there, you begin to recognize how related they are in a very concrete, even contiguous sense, like in the landscape, how related they are to the very industries that those folks were naming. So just to sketch it out a little bit further, those 16 prisons include federal prisons, state prisons, and private prisons, all of which have been proposed as putative sort of solutions to structural unemployment, right? The coal industry, the number of kind of coal jobs in the region is at its lowest total since the 19th century. And the prisons were proposed very explicitly as a resolution to the sort of job crisis, right? It's almost like a rural jobs program. At the same time, many of those communities were also able to almost like graft applications for infrastructure, extension, and renovation onto the prisons. So those communities, like quite literally, were unable to secure grant funding to do basic municipal infrastructure upgrades, extend water lines, build out roads, that kind of thing, but for the promise or presence of the prison. So those are the prisons, right? At the same time, because of the decline, not only in coal employment, but coal production, the counties in the coal fields have lost a once reliable source of revenue that was attached to production levels. And as that revenue has really bottomed out, and this was revenue that those counties were totally reliant on for all sorts of basic municipal things, paying public employees, keeping a fire station open, things like that. As that's happened, these counties have explicitly turned to jails as sources of revenue generation, specifically by housing overflow state prisoners in county jails for per diem payments, and by housing federal immigration detainees for ICE. Those agencies, either a state Department of Corrections or a federal agency like the Marshals or ICE, will pay upwards of over $100 a day per person that's incarcerated in a county jail. So to pull back from that sort of like somewhat granular analysis, to me what that does, what that insists upon, is saying, mass incarceration or prison proliferation, these terms do some important work, but they don't get us very far in understanding why this has happened. And it's really only through thinking about these various crises occurring in the moment, some of them sort of objective crises built into the model of capitalism, and some of them manufactured crises like prison overcrowding, how these crises kind of congeal in a moment when prisons and jails become sort of the solution for all of them. And that to me that's a conjunctural analysis. And that came mostly from folks on the ground.
I love that. Thanks so much for that explanation.
Yeah.
There's something I love you do at the opening of the book where you kind of set up this dichotomy that you just helped us explain, right? Where the book opens with this incredible panorama of Eastern Kentucky, where you're driving through the area. It's just experienced a massive storm.
Yeah.
And there are buildings on Main Street that are totally devastated, whereas you say the prisons are humming along, standing like fortresses. This is a really poignant image, especially now as Eastern Kentucky continues to recover from extensive recent flooding. But how do we make sense of a carceral world being built while a world of everyday life is being abandoned?
Yeah, that's also a great question. That moment was really powerful to stand on that Main Street in West Liberty, Kentucky. It was actually, I think it was 5 months after that tornado had passed through. And to see all of these buildings still totally decimated and devastated, and literally just like down the block, the prison just sort of humming along. And we had just come from a different prison that was maybe 10 or 15 miles down the road. So it set this contrast that you just named with the question. I think maybe the most sort of direct way to answer that, which I'll also sort of add to, comes from Ruthie Wilson Gilmore and Craig Gilmore, which is to say that in this kind of carceral conjuncture, organized violence has become the sort of answer to organized abandonment. And I think that's I don't know that I had that language in that moment when I was standing there in 2012, I think. But I think now looking back, that's what I was observing, and I felt it in that moment. And that's become all the more poignant now, as you say, because of the floods that happened at the very end of July of 2022, just a couple months ago. And in some ways it adds a really almost like devastating addendum to what I tried to lay out in that moment in the book. So the floods happened, I think all told it led to 50 deaths and hundreds of people who lost everything and are totally displaced. What I've heard since then from folks on the ground in Eastern Kentucky is that it's actually incredibly difficult to access FEMA funds for support, right, and to help with just the most immediate basic needs of rebuilding. So much so that a number of people have been outright rejected in their applications for FEMA funds, and everybody sort of expects to be rejected the first time around. So one way to think about that, right, is like that's one expression or capacity of the state that seems to be almost inaccessible and certainly deeply bureaucratic for people to access. On the other hand, what I know from talking to folks on the ground and from reading about it and whatnot is just days after the floods, so early August, the National Guard was on the ground, not just in its capacity to assist in cleanup and support, but it was actually the National Guard military police who were on the ground in a police power function to enforce a curfew and to suppress looting that supposedly was happening. Now, on top of that, what we know from just the end of September is that the Bureau of Prisons has just announced, I think it was September 28th, that they are resuming a process that was effectively defeated, which I think we'll probably talk about this hour. They're resuming the process to try and build yet another federal prison in eastern Kentucky in Letcher County, a county that was particularly hit hard by the flooding. And so in some ways there you have it, right? You have the state in sort of two forms or two expressions or two capacities. FEMA, which is supposed to be on the ground and assisting and whatnot, but which is totally inaccessible. And then readily available, sort of at the drop of a hat, police and prisons as putative solutions to this crisis. I don't know this for sure, but I somewhat expect that in their attempt to try and justify a new prison, which I should say again, if I didn't say it before, was defeated. It was defeated by a coalition of folks just a couple years ago in 2019, which I think we'll talk about, in their attempt to kind of resurrect that proposal and succeed in citing it in Letcher County. My guess is that prison boosters from the BOP to sort of the local power block will try to make an argument that the prison will in some ways support or assist or leverage the ability to kind of assist people who have been displaced.
This is a really heavy analysis to recall here in New Orleans, where, you know, on the way to get to the workshop, I passed by the Superdome, you know. I mean, I can't understand this city without thinking about Hurricane Katrina, and particularly that trade-off that you mentioned, right? People need aid, and what do they get? They get militarism, they get prisons, they get punished, they get criminalized. So, you know, we were talking a little bit about the flooding, and I just want to go back to that, because I think sometimes we imagine these as unrelated phenomenon, but your book does a really extraordinary job of helping us understand how climate crises, how flooding, how ecological disaster is actually tied to prison expansion, mass incarceration. So I wonder if you could just lay out that argument for us a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, maybe one place to start is with what's happened in the region through the extraction industry that has affected the region, full stop, but that I think has also, in some very concrete ways, sort of paved the way for the sort of prison industry to move in. And that's a process known as mountaintop removal, which listeners and viewers may be familiar with, but it's worth sort of laying out very briefly what it is. So the image that people from maybe outside of the coal fields have of coal mining is maybe the sort of older model of people actually going inside the mountain from the ground, deep inside the mountain, sometimes miles and miles inside, to mine coal. Revolution in production starting in around mid 20th century began processes called surface mining or strip mining, which involved accessing the coal from outside of the mountain by literally sort of stripping off pieces of the land. And in the 1970s, that process sort of accelerated into what one of the people I talked to on the ground calls strip mining on steroids, which is this process known as mountaintop removal, which involves the use of explosives, ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, or ANFO, to literally blow off the tops of mountains, like decapitate them, to access the coal from above. And during the height of mountaintop removal as a process, I think it involved, let's see, I think 2,500 tons of explosives per day, or 5 million pounds of explosives per day going off. And all told, that's led to all kinds of devastation, the loss of 500 mountains in the region and devastation of streams. Because what happens is the top of the mountain is blown off, and all of what the industry calls the overburden, what we would call biodiversity, right? Trees and wildlife and plants and topsoil and all of that, is pushed off the mountain and down into the valleys and streams below, which has had devastating effects for all kinds of reasons. Which we should also note in the process has enabled, and I would say accelerated, the ability for flooding to have really devastating consequences, because all of the things I just mentioned are part of kind of natural, water catchment processes. And MTR has really accelerated the process of those being sort of devastated and enabling floods to become sort of disasters. In the process, MTR, mountaintop removal, has produced sort of two surpluses. It's created land, hundreds of acres on each of these former mountains that previously wasn't there, on which people can now imagine and propose various forms of economic development, including prisons. So there are a number of prisons in the region, particularly in eastern Kentucky and southwestern Virginia, that are literally built on top of former mountains, on these flat expanses of land where mountains, at least tops of mountains, once stood. So it's produced surplus land newly available to house something like a prison, or any number of things we might be able to imagine, and people do imagine, but in this moment, prisons. At the same time, one miner working a mountaintop removal site can extract as much coal as, I think, 22 miners working in an underground mine. So what it has also done is contributed to this precipitous decline of coal employment and produced a situation where once and would-be coal miners who are now out of mining work are sort of newly available to potentially at least refashion themselves as prison guards. So there's a real, sort of like contiguous relationship in the landscape between these two. I should also say, just while we're talking about the kind of relationship between prisons and ecology and environmental devastation, the prisons themselves, we have to recognize that they literally come at the expense of so many other things that could conceivably go on these spaces, which of course could be anything, and certainly could go towards, climate change remediation and all kinds of, green jobs and things like that. But in this moment, it's the prisons that are on offer. So in a very, almost like simplistic way, the fact that the prisons are there means that something else is not. Right? The prisons themselves, too, also affect or potentially affect the ecology of the region. We know this from other fights around prisons in rural places. I'm thinking particularly of California and the role of, I think it was the kangaroo rat in trying to stop the Delano II prison. In eastern Kentucky, in response to the most recent attempt to build a prison in Letcher County, environmentalists and others raised the prison's threat to nearby, like a mile away, a stand of old-growth forest, one of the few remaining in the region, to various habitat for salamanders and the Indiana bat, and to all kinds of, and the potential effects of lights and fencing and whatnot on all kinds of flora and fauna in the region. So there's very kind of concrete ways that these things are connected.
Yeah, no, you sketch a really horrifying topography of how, I think sometimes when we think about prisons, we think so much about the prison itself, and we don't think about how it's deformed the entire landscape, and the kind of flooding that's happened wouldn't be possible without that kind of deformation. So, there's a part in your book I really love where you talk about, it's, on this land cleared by mountaintop removal and, filled just a whole mutated landscape, that it's from this space that only the prison gets imagined. I'm interested in our imaginary of prisons and mass incarceration, because I think your work does a lot of interesting things to disrupt some prevailing imaginaries, particularly when it comes to Central Appalachia. So right now, politically, there's a lot of cynical populist appeals to a so-called white working class, which is often conflated with Appalachia itself.
Yes.
And we have, figures like J.D. Vance, who deputize themselves as representatives of the white working class, and they depicted social problems as being largely unemployment and drug abuse. So this is not only a false narrative, but as you write, it's an imaginary that segregates our comprehension of carceral systems. So crime in prisons are being imagined as being geographically and also racially distant from the so-called white working class in Appalachia. But your book interrupts this imaginary, and I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how it does that.
Sure. There's a few things I'd say maybe at the outset about J.D. Vance himself that
Please.
I think, yeah, sure. And then I'll use that to kind of back into the other part of the question. So I think we have to understand J.D. Vance in a few ways. One, first as an author, people may be aware he wrote this kind of book that was on the New York Times bestseller list for a long time called Hillbilly Elegy, which is truly terrible. I would not recommend anybody to read it, but I took one for the team and did it and can sort of talk about it a little bit. But I think one thing that has to be understood is J.D. Vance, as noxious as that book is, I think we have to understand it as within a 150-year genre that literally started in the 1870s, that at that time was called local color writing. And it was journalists from New York and other places on the East Coast who traveled to Appalachia and really sort of began to kind of invent it as a sort of coherent place. And in their writing, I went back and read some of this, they really sort of worked to collapse topography and culture and language and region into one kind of composite representation of difference and deficiency and sometimes depravity. And there's a remarkable consistency, internal consistency between those representations from 150 years ago and the writings of somebody like J.D. Vance, or I'll put out another name, Kevin Williamson, who probably, without even realizing it, are reproducing some of the same tropes, language, frameworks that these authors from the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s were using to create this representation. So they are offering a particularly sort of noxious representation, but they are also sort of just extending this tradition into the present. But J.D. Vance isn't only an author, right? He's also, like you're saying, a kind of leading politician in this moment. And so I think we have to take him particularly seriously and recognize that his, sort of work at the level of representation has very, very clear and scary material consequences. And just as you sort of laid it out in the question, I think he's offering this sort of white nationalist and maybe even sort of proto-fascist analysis of very real crises, right? He's looking at the same crises as we are, and he's offering a solution to people, grounded, of course, in horrifying and terms that I think we have to take very seriously. What's particularly sort of interesting about what he's doing is, even as he offers this sort of pathological understanding of Eastern Kentucky, I mean, his book really engages in this really kind of lazy sociology where his own family's narrative, he sort of, there's this slippage between his own personal family story and this kind of pop sociological take on the region. Even as he engages in these arguments about an almost genetic kind of inferiority about the region, certainly a culture of poverty argument, he is also imagining the region as his kind of political base, even as we also know very clearly he's funded by people like Peter Thiel, he comes out of Yale Law School, like he's not, it's very clear, right? And I think we have to name how arrogant that is. But there's another another thing here that I think talking about him sort of opens up that we have to discuss, and it is this kind of concept of that he's imagining of Appalachia as standing in for this imagined sort of white working class, right? And as those two, that identity and that region being almost interchangeable. What that representation does is erase a lot of history, and also really misrepresent certain demographic realities. So first of all, Appalachia is a multiracial place. Mm-hmm. And in particular sub-regions of Appalachia, people of color account for large shares of the population. So just in the kind of rhetorical move of substituting white working class for Appalachia, there's a complete erasure of all kinds of communities. Having said that, there are communities, particularly in the sub-region of Central Appalachia, that are largely white, almost exclusively white. But even there, to understand that as some sort of primordial feature of that sub-region erases all of these historical processes that, from processes of native removal and the expropriation of indigenous lands to 20th century processes of mechanization that hit Black and immigrant miners first and hardest and led to their departure or expulsion from the region. So even in these seemingly white spaces, there's all kinds of traces of, racialized violence. Mm-hmm. One thing I do think we still have to take very seriously is that in these communities where prisons are now being proposed and built, you do have a potential dynamic where white communities are being potentially sort of deputized to sell their labor, to act as prison guards for a deeply multiracial, deeply racialized prison population. And I think what's happening there is, sort of two processes at once: criminalization on the one hand and employment on the other, that are potentially bringing two populations that we might understand as having similar relationships to at least capitalism, similar relationships in terms of their class position, mm-hmm. bringing them together into the same sort of physical space like a prison, but forcefully differentiated by their relationship to state violence, right? By the relationship to, one on the side of the cage through employment and one on the side of the cage through criminalization. Mm. The only thing I would add to that, to walk that analysis back just a hair, is that what we know from some great work done in the last 5 years or so is that white Appalachians are not immune to criminalization and ensnarement by the carceral state. And so even as I think that analysis that I just offered holds, mm-hmm. those same folks who are being deputized into this central institutional site of racialized class war are themselves also vulnerable to criminalization and winding up on the other side of the bars as well.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate this, and I appreciate the attentiveness you have to the very fraught politics of representation and talking about Appalachia. One thing I really admire about the book is that you both note them and then kind of navigate them very skillfully. The book is deeply in dialogue with the photographs of Jill Frank, the photographer. And I think you talk about how this enables you to not just talk about the, prisons themselves, but as you say, what they interface with. And I think there's a very interesting way that this puts you in dialogue with a number of scholars, activists / cultural producers like Trevor Paglin, who's thinking about Black sites, or Sandel Burke, who does these incredible landscapes of California prisons, or Jack Norton's photography, or Brett Story's documentaries. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit specifically about your engagement with, that politics of representation, and maybe specifically how it helps you think about these interfaces.
Yeah, I knew from the outset that I was interested in having photographs in the book, but it wasn't until I actually, and Jill is this incredibly skilled artist and photographer who I have a long friendship with. And so we worked together really well, and her photographs are incredible. I have to say, I knew that I was interested in having photographs in the book as potentially as a way to sort of engage with and interrupt this long history of over and misrepresentation of the region. What I don't know that I realized at the outset, and which I came to realize through my own engagement with the photos that Jill took, was that they became another kind of method for exploring and even understanding and deepening my own understanding of these interfaces. So I'll give you a very concrete example. The photo that became the book's cover shows the literal sort of interface between a prison on one side of the image and an old coal seam on the other. This is this prison in Wheelwright, Kentucky, an old coal company town. That day, I was there and I was interviewing a couple of people, both former correctional officers at that prison. And Jill was standing there and she was like, I'm gonna go take some photographs. And I was like, great. And then later that night or the next day, we were looking through the images that she took and I saw that one. And I immediately realized there was something very generative there for me. And I would continue to sort of come back to it over the years. And I think what that photograph captures is, of course, on its face, the literal interface between the prison and what surrounds it in space, in this case, an old coal seam. Excuse me, but also what I came to see as in a slightly more abstract sense, the analytical space that I wanted the book to occupy, just to the side of the actual prison, to sort of see it in relationship to what surrounds it in time and space and history and in geography. Now, I almost like Conjuncture, like thinking through conjunctural analysis, I already had that somewhere, right? Having engaged so much, particularly with Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work over the years, and she speaks about the importance of interfaces very specifically and beautifully in Golden Gulag. So it was there somewhere. But it was also through engaging with the images of Jill's that I think it became more grounded and concrete for me in the particular context in which I was working as a sort of method.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought attention to the cover photo, which is gorgeous, and particularly that interface, because, I think Central Appalachia, the Appalachian region, is mostly known as coal country, right? And I think the book does a really interesting job of actually delving into not just the kind of analysis of the coal industry at present, but the long history of the presence of the, coal in the region, of coal company towns, and of the fierce labor wars that happen in the area. And so when you were talking earlier about this practice of people being deputized into this is something you talk about in the book, not in the present day, but in relationship to the management of these coal company towns. You say in the book that the coal industry, quote, foreshadows the role of the prison in the same coal fields and same community 100 years later. Can you explain this?
Sure, yeah. The coal industry's emergence and hegemony in the coal fields really wouldn't have been possible without police power and without other approaches to trying to discipline a labor force and keep unions out that we could conceivably call something else like welfare capitalism, but which I think is also deeply related to the police and to the police power. So in some places, in many places in the coal fields, coal companies relied explicitly on some kind of armed police force. Sometimes that looked like the actual cops or sheriffs. Sometimes it looked like mine guards. Sometimes it looked like what people knew then and taught and described now as gun thugs, like hired people who are armed from Chicago and places like that, to keep the unions out and police mining communities into docility. So Wheelwright took a somewhat different approach. Wheelwright was founded by coal companies, a coal company, in the late 19-teens, and over the next 60 years or so was bought and sold between coal companies and didn't even achieve independence as its own town until the 1980s. But during its sort of like heyday, as community members remember it, the coal company went to great lengths to ensure a kind of commitment from wheelwright residents to the company. They built out golf courses, swimming pools. There was a movie theater, and this is a very, very small town, movie theater, and other kinds of amenities. This was the coal company's approach to, of course, both offering the mines as a site of production or work, but also to sort of assisting and facilitating community level sort of social reproduction, right? Another thing I would add here that coal companies did, including in wheelwright, was to support backyard gardening, which we could see as both enhancing a given family's commitment to staying in a particular place and maybe somewhat subtly offloading some of the costs of social reproduction onto the household. Part of what I think has happened now in this kind of moment of precipitous decline in both production and work is the prison has collapsed a lot of those approaches into sort of, into one formation. The prison offers itself as both a site of production or work, but also has become crucial, talks about itself at least as crucial to social reproduction at various scales of household, community, county, and region. There's a few things to say here. One is, in one sense, I'm making the argument that prisons have somewhat replaced the coal industry as this sort of site of production. There are ways that is, on its face, totally not true, right? Like at the height of employment in the coal industry, there were 75,000 people employed by coal companies in Kentucky. Today, as I think I said at the beginning, that number is under 4,000. And prison jobs have displaced, as that number has fallen to 4,000, right? Prison jobs have surpassed it by thousands. There's like 6,500 prison jobs in Kentucky, while there are under 4,000 mining jobs in Kentucky. At the same time, right, there is this dense, expansive carceral geography of the region, and the number of prison jobs is not even a tenth of what the mining jobs were at the height of coal mining. So it can't really be that the prison economy is totally replacing the coal economy. So if it's not exactly that, even as the prisons are marketed as rural economic development, particularly around jobs, then what is it actually that they're doing? And that's where I think this concept of what I call carceral social reproduction or social reproduction theory, whatever, which we get from Marxist feminists, becomes so crucial to understanding this. I've talked about it a little bit already with respect to, basic infrastructure. I'll give you a specific example back in Wheelwright, actually. The prison that is in Wheelwright was built by and operated by a private prison company. It closed in 2012. And it just reopened as a state prison where the state of Kentucky is leasing it from the private prison company, from CoreCivic. The judge executive, the lead executive of the county, when asked what it means to have the prison reopening, this was just a couple years ago, said something to the effect of, it means a lot. We'll have 200 people coming here for jobs. That means 200 people shopping. It means new money for cleaning up the city. It means new money for building roads, people eating in our restaurants, things like that, right? It was a very sort of literal response to the question of what is the sort of broader work that the prison does? Well, it assists in building out or sustaining or whatever your local regional infrastructure. So there's that element to it. There are also in the record from all of these prisons being built, there's a lot of testimonies about the prison being essential to keeping rural health clinics open and hospitals open and community centers. And, perhaps most densely in the literature and maybe also most devastatingly, schools. And this was one of the parts of doing the work that I think was most most sort of impactful and also most maybe important to discuss. In a lot of these communities, both including during my at the time that I was active doing the research empirically, so like in Letcher County, for example, but then also in the historical record from when these other prisons were built in the late 90s and early 2000s, one sees all of these counties preparing to or actively reorganizing their educational programs and curricula to maintain and boost out enrollments, but also to try and prepare what they saw as a future labor force for jobs in the carceral economy. So I mean like actually like building out criminal justice programs, building out firing ranges and mock courtrooms, community colleges building out associate's and bachelor's degrees in criminal justice, and very, very explicitly education officials in these counties talking about how essential this was because of the surrounding prison economy and the opportunity for employment there. So in those ways, it's kind of deeply attached to the long history of these sorts of fights, labor fights, and deeply attached to also the ways that the coal companies and now the prisons are kind of deeply embedded in efforts for social reproduction, which is just another way of saying efforts for people to see a future for themselves or their children or whatever in the region.
That's devastating. And I appreciate your attention to the kind of way the prison builds a world in its own image and how we have to be able to imagine something beyond it.
Yes.
I want to say, one of the things that's the most powerful about this book and all your work is that this is definitely a movement book. It comes out of your insights from being a part of, as you said, historic victorious struggles to stop the building of the federal prison in Letcher County, Kentucky. And you really get a sense in reading the book that you have deep reverence for knowledge produced collectively in struggle. And there are wonderful ways that you highlight other activists in the region, like documentarian Amelia Kirby, and I'm just going to make sure I get all the names right, the Apple Shop radio shows like Holler to the Hood or Calls from Home, organizers like Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, and significantly, you even co-author a chapter with the scholar activist Sylvia Ryerson. This is a really uncommon approach to be this generous in a scholarly monograph. I wonder if you could just explain why these were important choices for you to make.
I mean, first, it means a lot to hear you call it a movement book. I mean, I think that's the best that one can hope for. I suppose I'd say a few things. I mean, I myself come out of and still am a part of organizations and movements for a number of things, but particularly around abolishing the prison industrial complex. So I come into the work with that background, and I don't shed that as a scholar. So there's that kind of, that sort of direct response. What's also happened, though, is particularly with this book, is that about halfway through my time doing the research for it, the process to build United States Penitentiary Letcher accelerated, right? This prison had been in the works since 2005. I sort of started this research in 2011, 2012, and it accelerated around 2015, 2016. And there were a few years there, really the last half of my time working on the book, where this was really foregrounded for a lot of us. And maybe it's worth saying a few things about what happened during that struggle that I think maybe speak to the importance of my decisions and feeling of a sense of almost like deference to a number of the folks you mentioned. The plan to build USP Letcher failed. And it failed in this incredibly historic sense because a coalition of forces that was sort of nascent, but which kind of coalesced into a real force during this period of acceleration, worked together across scale and site and strategy to beat it. And they succeeded. And I'll say just a word maybe about a few different components of that coalition, which I think speaks to why I made these choices in the book. There were local landowners like Mitch Whitaker, who I spend a lot of time talking about in the book, who whose land was included in the original rendering of the site to house USP Letcher, and who refused. And refused not really, in one reading you might read his refusal as a kind of NIMBYism, but it really wasn't. It was an understanding of the history of his own land, which included his grandfather fighting coal companies from taking it, and which Mitch, in the moment, saw his own fight as kind of part of that legacy. He understood the BOP in conversation with the coal industry as trying to take his land. And so he had this steadfast commitment, and his own refusal wound up delaying the prison project on its own by like a year or two. But he joined a number of other folks, including other local folks in Letcher County, organizers on the ground, many of whom were politicized by this radio show you mentioned, which is worth saying something about. This is a radio show hosted by this stalwart media arts organization, Appalachia, which broadcasts and has broadcasted since the late 90s, a radio show into, it broadcasts it regionally, and it reaches, I think, 8 prisons in the listening range in southwestern Virginia and in eastern Kentucky. And it started as a hip-hop show and now has become both a radio show and a way for people in prison and their loved ones on the outside to communicate through sending messages of love and support, and through shout-outs and through song requests. And folks who DJ the show talk about how deeply politicizing it is to experience at such an affective level the violence of mass incarceration. And so when the prison proposal accelerated, I think they saw this as, this is how they engage in the struggle against the carceral state, by saying not, by refusing this. Crucially, they developed one of the most kind of moving parts of their opposition was the development of this hashtag R444million, which was the original price tag, about $500 million to build a prison. And the hashtag and the campaign around it was developed on the ground in Letcher County, but also in sort of study and struggle with social movement organizations around the South and other campaigns against police and prisons. It was their way of both sort of demanding a form of sort of grassroots democratized development in the region, and disavowing the prison and explicitly saying, we refuse development premised on or built on the backs of other poor folks, right? In addition to those local on-the-ground folks, there were national activists and attorneys who really waged an incredible, rigorous campaign through the environmental process that's required under law to build the prison, and who, fought really hard to impugn all of the statements from the Bureau of Prisons. And then there were people in prison who also wrote in and who eventually joined a lawsuit. So taken all together, through delay and impugning the process and intervening in all kinds of supposedly kind of calcified common sense around prisons as rural economic development, this coalition really undermined the prison's credibility and led to its defeat. And I was a part of this in some ways, and as I was, as it came time to really finish the book and write it, and there really was, it just had to be as prominent as I'm glad it comes through in the book, because that's the history, right? I don't think this happens without the work of Amelia Kirby to develop Calls from Home and to make the film, without the work of Sylvia Ryerson, whose work on the prison geography of the region is really foundational, without the work of Appalachia, without the work of many, many people who I do go to some effort to include, and who I think of as sort of interlocutors for the project.
Wonderful. I appreciate this, Judah. And, this book, like your first book, Progressive Punishment, they're both movement books. And that book, Progressive Punishment, details an incredible fight against carceral expansion in Bloomington, Indiana. But as you note, instead of a conservative, tough on crime, political campaign, you describe how it was liberals who are promoting jail expansion through a paradigm of social justice, renaming jails as a justice campus. So with the closing of the notorious jail on Rikers Island, in New York City is now proposing to build a, quote, women's center for justice, what they call a responsive and progressive jail in Harlem that will, quote, revolutionize the treatment of women and gender expansive people. So I know this is unfair at the end of a long interview, but can you help us understand the limitations of so-called progressive punishment?
Sure, yeah. We faced, in Bloomington, I was part of a group that began organizing against this proposal for what proponents were calling a justice campus, which, it's worth saying, was massive. It would have sat on 85 acres. It would have exponentially expanded that county's ability to incarcerate and surveil and detain and monitor people. What was particularly notable and difficult for us as organizers at the time, and this is in 2007, 2008, was that it was pretty much exclusively the project of the county's civic and political liberal and progressive elite. Full stop. Who I think believed in the county's ability to extend its sort of social welfare orientation into the jails to address various crises of overcrowding at the current jail and, the extension of support, education, treatment, whatever, to a huge sort of incarcerated population. It posed a challenge for us. I mean, in that moment, this felt fairly new, particularly for those of us who, at that time, had been active for a while on issues of fighting the prison industrial complex, and were used to sort of the tough on crime orientation to justify carceral expansion. And so our work, entailed doing a lot of popular education to try and disrupt this notion that more cages was somehow a solution to crises of cages in the first place. And I have to say that proved somewhat successful by pushing some of the liberal and progressive leaders who were advocating for the Justice Campus, by pushing them to examine this belief in the benevolence of police or cages, and to do that in very specific ways. We wound up dislodging some support there. For these folks, they were somehow able to imagine, and I mean, I should say that some of these folks really spoke in very critical language when it came to diagnosing mass incarceration. They talked about ending the drug war. Some of them used the term prison industrial complex, and yet in the same breath, they would turn around and endorse the Justice Campus, which I imagine is probably very similar to what's happening on the ground in New York City and in many other places around the country now. So part of our job, I think, as organizers was to say, no, what you're doing is kind of misrecognizing our scale, right? Like what you're talking about doing and building is simply the enlargement of this thing you're diagnosing when it comes to Indiana or the United States, just scaled to the county level. The Justice Campus is the carceral state at the level of the county, right? I think sometimes folks there, and I'm guessing this is also true in New York City, have this sort of notion of community, a romanticization of community that can somehow operate outside the confines of our political economy and larger system. And that's not to say that there aren't really important ways we should struggle for community. But I think when you ignore that community can very much just simply be a scale of the state, particularly when you're talking about building out massive carceral infrastructure, you're misrecognizing the problem. And so that was a lot of our approach. It is sort of wild to have been engaged in that work so long ago and written that book, which came out in 2015, and now see what James Kilgore, I think, really helpfully has called carceral humanism, see that become maybe, I don't know, a central tendency, if not the central tendency, underwriting at least jail expansion, if not prison expansion today. I'd be the first to say I didn't necessarily see that coming, but I think we have to be really principled in our opposition to it, and to recognize that this is just another entry point into understanding this as a carceral conjuncture, right? This is still cages being proposed as solutions to various crises. Some of them sort of objective crises, some of them more subjective crises or fabricated crises like mass incarceration or overcrowding, but it's still cages, right? And I would also, I think, just be sure to say there's the incredible, late, wonderful social movement organizer Rose Braz called this long before I did, long before James Kilgore did, in an incredible piece that I would encourage everybody to read, where she sort of goes at gender responsive caging in California. So even as this may be a new sort of central tendency justifying expansion, it is a logic that's been around for a while. And I think we would do well to be just as steadfast in opposing it.
Absolutely. Well, Judah, is there anything I haven't asked you that you'd like to bring up?
Maybe I'll just end by saying, we talked about it earlier. This coalition of folks succeeded in defeating United States Penitentiary Letcher in 2019. Since then, 3 years ago, the state of Kentucky reopened a private prison in Wheelwright, which I said, and reopened it as a state prison. And there's been significant jail expansion around Kentucky for reasons we talked about related to the decline of the coal industry. And I think it's an indication that we have to be attentive to the way that the carceral state can kind of move across scale. So defeated at the level of a federal prison, it can kind of move and emerge at the level of the state or a county. And I think we have to pay attention to that. Now, at the same time, as we also talked about just in late September, the Bureau of Prisons has announced its attempt to resurrect a plan to build 2 prisons in Letcher County, a medium security prison and a minimum security prison, on the same land in this community called Roxana, adjacent to Mitch Whitaker's property. So we also have to pay attention to not just scale, but the fact that the carceral state can be beaten and retreat, and it can reemerge, right, and probably try and adapt to what it observed and probably studied in terms of our opposition to try and make itself more palatable or whatever in a new moment, in a new context. And just based on some initial conversations, I think people are aware of what's happening, and this is just this will be the sort of next iteration of this fight.
Well, as you say, the carceral state evolves as it studies, and so it's on us to evolve and study as well. And I appreciate so much your work for helping us in that fight and in that study. So thank you so much, Judah Schept, for being with us today. And thanks to all our listeners and viewers, and stay tuned.